The rain hammered against the windows of Miller's diner like angry fists, each drop exploding against the glass in a symphony of desperation. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floor. It was nearly closing time on a Thursday night in downtown Phoenix, and the diner was almost empty except for a few regulars, nursing their coffee and the lingering smell of fried onions. That's when she appeared. Margaret Williams, 73 years old, stood in the doorway like a ghost from another era. Her gray hair was plastered to her head from the storm, and her worn coat, once blue, now faded to the color of old bruises, dripped steadily onto the entrance mat. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle that most people would have mistaken for rags, but anyone who looked closer could see the tiny face peeking out from beneath a threadbare blanket. Her great-grandson, Tommy, barely 4 years old, with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "Ma'am, we're closed," barked Jerry Stevens, the night manager, without even looking up from his cash register. His voice cut through the warm air of the diner like a blade. Jerry was the kind of man who measured his worth by the number of rules he could enforce, his chest puffed out with the authority of someone who had never known real power. "Can't you read the sign?" Margaret's weathered hands trembled as she adjusted her grip on the sleeping child. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "We just need somewhere warm for a few hours. The shelter downtown is full and—" "Look, lady," Jerry interrupted, his tone growing sharper as he finally looked up, taking in her soaked appearance with obvious disgust. "This isn't a charity. You want warm? Try the McDonald's down the street. They got heat." The few remaining customers began to stir, some craning their necks to get a better look at the unfolding drama. Mrs. Henderson, a regular who came in every Thursday after her bridge club, shook her head disapprovingly. "Some people have no shame," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Coming into a respectable establishment looking like that." Tommy stirred in Margaret's arms, his small voice cutting through the tension like a prayer. "Grandma Maggie, I'm hungry," he whispered, his words carrying the weight of too many missed meals. Jerry's face hardened further. "That's it. You need to leave. Now, before I call the police." But in the back corner booth, someone had been watching. Someone whose presence in the diner had gone completely unnoticed by Jerry and the handful of customers. Marcus Thompson sat quietly, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 45, Marcus had the build of a man who knew hard work, broad shoulders, strong arms, and eyes that held stories of struggle and perseverance. His simple work shirt and jeans gave no hint of what he really was, what he owned, or the power he wielded. Marcus had been coming to Miller's Diner for 3 months now, always sitting in the same corner booth. Always ordering the same thing, coffee, black, and whatever pie was fresh. Jerry never paid him much attention. Just another working man grabbing a bite after a long shift. How wrong he was. As Margaret's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs, and little Tommy's whimpers grew louder, Marcus felt something stir deep in his chest. A memory, a feeling, a recognition that would change everything. What Jerry didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just another customer, he was the owner. But before we dive into the story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us share more stories. Marcus Thompson had never intended to hide who he was. 3 months ago, when he first bought Miller's Diner from old Pete Miller, he'd planned to announce himself properly, maybe throw a little celebration for the staff. But life had taught Marcus to watch and listen first. Growing up in the foster system in Cleveland, bouncing from house to house, he'd learned that people showed their true colors when they thought no one important was watching. So he watched. Marcus had worked 3 jobs to put himself through community college, then business school. He'd saved every penny, lived in a studio apartment with a leaky roof, and eaten ramen noodles for dinner more nights than he cared to remember. All to buy this place, his first real investment, his chance to create something good in the world. He dreamed of running a diner where everyone felt welcome, where families could make memories over shared meals, where people like his younger self could find a warm place and a kind word. Jerry Stevens had been Pete Miller's night manager for 8 years, and Marcus had kept him on, thinking experience mattered. What Marcus discovered was that Jerry ruled the night shift like a petty dictator. Jerry was 42, divorced twice, and lived in the same apartment complex he'd moved into fresh out of high school. He drove a pickup truck with more rust than paint and wore his authority like armor against a world that had never given him much respect anywhere else. Jerry had a particular talent for spotting what he considered undesirable customers. Anyone who looked like they couldn't afford to leave a decent tip. Anyone whose clothes weren't clean enough. Anyone whose skin color was too dark or whose accent sounded foreign. He'd found ways to make them feel unwelcome. Slow service, cold food, or sometimes just a look that said, "You don't belong here." The regular customers had learned not to question Jerry's methods. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming to the diner for 15 years, preferred the predictable comfort of seeing the same faces, the same routine. She didn't like it when those people came in and disrupted her peaceful Thursday night ritual. Dave Martinez, a truck driver who stopped in twice a week, usually kept his head down and minded his own business. He'd grown up poor himself. But now that he had steady work and could afford his meals, he didn't want any trouble. Sarah Collins, the waitress working the evening shift, was different. At 26, she was working her way through nursing school, and she'd seen enough of life to know that kindness costs nothing. But Jerry was her boss, and she needed this job. She'd learned to bite her tongue when Jerry turned people away, even when it made her stomach turn. As Margaret stood there dripping and desperate, Marcus saw everything clearly. The casual cruelty, the turned backs, the fear disguised as righteousness. He saw a system that protected the comfortable while punishing the vulnerable. And in that moment, he knew exactly what kind of owner he was going to be. "I said you need to leave. Now!" Jerry's voice rose, cutting through the diner like a whip crack. He stepped out from behind the counter, his chest puffed out, his face red with irritation. "I don't care about your sob story. This is a business, not a homeless shelter." Margaret clutched Tommy tighter, her voice shaking. "Please, sir, we're not asking for charity. I have $3. I can pay for a cup of coffee, and we'll just sit quietly until the rain stops." Jerry laughed, a harsh sound that made several customers wince. $3? Lady, you smell like a dumpster. You're dripping all over my clean floor. You think I want my paying customers eating their dinner next to whatever this is?" He gestured dismissively at Margaret and Tommy. "Mrs. Orrin," Henderson nodded approvingly from her booth. "Jerry's right. There are children present. This is inappropriate." She pointedly looked at the young family in the corner booth, a mother and father with two well-dressed kids who were now staring openly at the scene. The father whispered loudly to his wife, "Should we leave? I don't want the kids to see this." His wife shook her head in disgust, gathering their things. "Come on, kid. We'll find somewhere else for dessert." Jerry's face grew redder as he watched potential revenue walk out the door. "Now look what you've done," he snapped at Margaret. "You've cost me customers." Sarah stepped forward hesitantly, her hands twisting the dish rag she'd been using to wipe tables. "Jerry, maybe we could just let them sit for a few minutes. The storm's getting worse, and the little boy—" "Sarah, you keep your mouth shut if you want to keep your job," Jerry barked, spinning around to face her. "I don't pay you to think. I pay you to serve food and clean tables. That's it." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and anger, but she stepped back, her need for this job outweighing her conscience. She couldn't afford to lose another position, not when she was this close to finishing school. Tommy began to cry softly, the sound barely audible, but somehow filling the entire diner. His small voice broke as he asked, "Grandma Maggie, why is the man being mean to us?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hide. "Shh, baby, it's okay. We'll find somewhere else." Jerry's patience snapped completely. "Oh, now the kid's crying. Perfect. Just perfect." He pulled out his phone with dramatic flourish. "That's it. I'm calling the cops. Maybe they can explain to you what no loitering means." The diner fell completely silent, except for the rain and Tommy's quiet sobs. Dave Martinez stared down at his half-eaten burger, his jaw clenched. Mrs. Henderson smiled with satisfaction, pleased that order was being restored. Sarah stood frozen, caught between her conscience and her paycheck. But in his corner booth, Marcus felt something inside him catch fire. He thought about all those nights when he was Tommy's age, hungry and scared, when adults had looked at him like he was trash. He thought about the social workers who talked about him like he wasn't there, the foster families who'd made him feel like an unwelcome burden, the teachers who'd written him off before giving him a chance. Marcus's hands slowly unclenched from around his coffee cup. For 3 months, he'd watched Jerry operate like this, telling himself he was gathering information, learning the business. But now he saw the truth. He'd been a coward, hiding behind his anonymity, while Jerry turned away people who needed help. Not anymore. Jerry was already dialing when Marcus finally stood up from his booth, his 6-foot frame unfolding slowly, deliberately. His movement was so quiet, so controlled, that most people didn't notice at first. But something in the air had changed. Marcus's mind drifted back 23 years, to a cold February night in Cleveland. He was 11 years old, standing in the doorway of Murphy's Corner Cafe with his foster sister Lisa, both of them soaked from walking 6 blocks in a snowstorm. Their foster dad had kicked them out during one of his drunken rages, and they had nowhere to go. The owner of Murphy's, an elderly Irish man named Patrick, could have easily turned them away. 2 scared kids with no money, dripping snow on his floors, probably bringing down the mood of his dinner crowd. Instead, Patrick had looked at them for a long moment, then quietly set 2 bowls of soup on the counter. "On the house," he'd said simply. "Nobody should be hungry on a night like this." That bowl of soup had saved Marcus's life in more ways than one, not just because it filled his empty stomach, but because it showed him what kindness looked like, what it meant to use whatever power you had to help instead of harm. Years later, when Marcus was working his way through business school, he'd gone back to Murphy's Corner Cafe. Patrick was still there, grayer but still serving soup to anyone who needed it. Marcus had tried to pay him back for that long-ago kindness, but Patrick just smiled and said, "Pass it forward, son. That's how the world gets better." Now, watching Jerry dial the police while a 4-year-old boy cried in his grandmother's arms, Marcus felt Patrick's words echo in his chest. He thought about the business plan he'd written for this diner purchase, the one that talked about creating community value and serving all customers with dignity. He thought about the employee handbook he'd been drafting in secret, the one that would make it clear that discrimination had no place in his establishment. Marcus had spent 3 months sitting in this corner booth, taking notes on everything, which suppliers delivered on time, which equipment needed replacing, how the staff interacted with customers. He'd been preparing to step into his role as owner, but he'd been doing it from the shadows, watching, learning, staying invisible. He told himself he was being smart, being careful, but as he watched Margaret's shoulders shake with silent desperation, he realized he'd been lying to himself. He hadn't been careful. He'd been scared. Scared of confrontation, scared of making mistakes, scared of having to make the hard decisions that came with real responsibility. His business degree from Cleveland State was framed on the wall of his small apartment, right next to the deed to Miller's Diner that he'd signed 3 months ago. Both documents represented dreams he'd fought for, sacrificed for, earned through years of 16-hour days and sleepless nights. But right now, in this moment, they were just pieces of paper. What mattered was what Patrick had taught him all those years ago. When you see someone who needs help and you have the power to help them, you step up, even if it changes everything. "Jerry!" The single word cut through the chaos like a knife through butter. Marcus's voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the diner freeze. Even Tommy stopped crying. Jerry looked up from his phone, annoyed at being interrupted. "What do you want, pal? Can't you see I'm handling a situation here?" Marcus took 3 slow steps toward the counter, his work boots clicking against the linoleum floor. Each step seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Put the phone down." "Excuse me?" Jerry's voice cracked slightly, something in Marcus's tone making him uneasy. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but I know exactly who I am." Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a weathered leather wallet. From it, he extracted a folded piece of paper, official, legal, with the state seal clearly visible. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact with Jerry. "The question is, do you know who I am?" Jerry's face went pale as Marcus held up the document. Even from across the room, The bold letters at the top were clearly visible. Business license. And below that, owner Marcus Thompson. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. That's right, Jerry. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more commanding. I'm Marcus Thompson. I own this place. I've owned it for 3 months. And for 3 months, I've been sitting in that booth, watching you turn away customers, watching you treat people like garbage, watching you use my business to feed your own petty prejudices. Jerry's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His phone clattered to the floor. But you said you were. I never said I was anything. You just assumed. Marcus stepped closer, and Jerry instinctively backed away. You assumed because I wore work clothes that I was nobody important. You assumed because I sat quietly that I didn't matter. Just like you assume that Mrs. Williams and her great-grandson didn't deserve basic human decency because they don't look like your idea of valuable customers. The entire diner erupted in whispers. Mrs. Henderson's coffee cup rattled against her saucer as her hands shook. Dave Martinez looked up from his burger, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth hanging open. Marcus turned to address the whole diner, his voice carrying to every corner. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am the owner of Miller's Diner. 3 months ago, I bought this place because I believed it could be something special, a place where everyone, and I mean everyone, is treated with respect. He turned back to Jerry, who was now backing toward the wall. Jerry, you're fired. Effective immediately. Clean out your locker and leave your keys on the counter. You can't do this to me. Jerry's voice rose to a near shriek. I've been here 8 years. 8 years. You can't just walk in here and... I'm not walking in here, Jerry. I own here. And I can absolutely fire someone who discriminates against customers, who threatens to call the police on a grandmother and her 4-year-old great-grandson for the crime of seeking shelter from a storm. Marcus walked over to Margaret, who was staring at him with tears streaming down her face. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Tommy, his voice gentle. Hi there, buddy. What's your name? Tommy, the little boy whispered, his eyes still wide with confusion and fear. Nice to meet you, Tommy. I'm Marcus. Are you hungry? Tommy nodded shyly. Marcus stood and looked at Margaret. Ma'am, I'm so sorry for how you've been treated in my establishment. This is not who we are, and it's not who we're going to be. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing in shock. Sarah, would you please show Mrs. Williams and Tommy to the best booth in the house and bring them whatever they'd like from the menu? On the house. Sarah snapped back to life, a huge smile spreading across her face. Yes, sir, Mr. Thompson. Right away. As Margaret began to cry with relief and Tommy's face lit up at the mention of food, Jerry made one last desperate attempt. This is insane. You'll regret this. I'll sue you for wrongful termination. Marcus looked at him calmly. Jerry, I've been documenting your behavior for 3 months. Discrimination based on appearance, economic status, and perceived social class. I have witnesses, I have dates, and I have a legal right to terminate employees who create hostile environments for customers. Feel free to call a lawyer. Jerry's face crumpled as the reality of his situation hit him. He was nobody special. He never had been. And now everyone knew it. 20 minutes later, Jerry Stevens walked out of Miller's Diner for the last time, his shoulders hunched, carrying a cardboard box with his few personal belongings. The rain had stopped, but Jerry looked like the storm was just beginning for him. As he reached his rusted pickup truck, he turned back one last time to see through the window what he'd lost. Inside, the diner had transformed. Margaret and Tommy sat in the corner booth that had the best view of the kitchen, where they could watch Sarah and the cook prepare their meal. Tommy was coloring on the back of a placemat with crayons that Sarah had found in the supply closet. His earlier tears replaced with the focused concentration that only children could manage. Margaret kept looking around in wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. Mr. Thompson, Sarah approached Marcus hesitantly, her eyes still wide with amazement. I just want to say what you did tonight. I've been wanting to stand up to Jerry for months, but I was scared of losing my job. Marcus smiled warmly. Sarah, you never have to be afraid to do the right thing here. Not anymore. In fact, I've been watching how you treat customers, how hard you work. I'd like to offer you the night manager position, if you're interested. It comes with a raise and health benefits that will help with your nursing school. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy. Are you serious? Really? Really? Someone who cares about people the way you do deserves to be in a position where they can make a difference. Dave Martinez cleared his throat from his booth. The truck driver had been quiet all evening, but now he stood up and walked over to Marcus. Sir, I want to apologize. I've been coming here for 2 years, and I've seen Jerry treat people badly before. I should have said something. I should have stood up. Marcus shook his head. Dave, we all make choices about when to speak up. The important thing is that we learn and do better next time. You're always welcome here. Mrs. Henderson remained in her booth, but Marcus could see her stealing glances at Margaret and Tommy. Finally, she got up and walked over to their table. Excuse me, she said quietly to Margaret. I wanted to apologize for what I said earlier. It was wrong. Margaret looked up, surprised. Thank you for saying that. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then sat down across from her. I have a grandson about Tommy's age. I can't imagine. She trailed off, looking ashamed. Would you mind if I bought him a piece of pie? The apple pie here is really good. Tommy looked up from his coloring, his face brightening. I like pie. For the first time that evening, Margaret truly smiled. Word spread quickly through the small neighborhood. By the next morning, the local newspaper had picked up the story. Local business owner shows true leadership, read the headline, with a photo of Marcus serving breakfast to a line of customers that stretched out the door. The reporter had interviewed several people who were there that night. Sarah's quote made the front page. Mr. Thompson didn't just fire someone who was wrong. He showed all of us what it means to use power to help people instead of hurt them. But the real change was quieter, deeper. Over the following weeks, Miller's Diner became known as a place where everyone was welcome. The food was still the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Families came for Sunday breakfast. College students studied over coffee. Elderly customers lingered over their meals, enjoying conversation with staff who actually cared. Margaret and Tommy became regulars. Every Thursday night, they came in for dinner, and Tommy would show Marcus his latest drawings. Margaret had found a job at a local grocery store in a small apartment nearby. She never forgot to tell people about the night when a stranger's kindness changed her life. As for Jerry, he eventually found work at a fast food chain across town. Sometimes late at night, he would drive past Miller's Diner and see the warm lights, the full parking lot, the families laughing together inside. He never stopped, but those moments made him think about the kind of man he'd been and the kind of man he might still become. The night that changed everything had taught everyone a simple truth. How we treat the most vulnerable among us reveals who we really are. 2 years later, Marcus stood in the same spot where he'd first revealed his identity to Jerry. But everything had changed. Miller's Diner had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope in the community. The walls were now covered with photos of regular customers, local high school graduates, and community events. A small plaque by the door read, "Everyone welcome always." But the real change was in the stories that filled the space every day. Tommy, now 6 years old, had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds of healthy weight. He still came in every Thursday with Grandma Maggie, but now he brought his school drawings to show Marcus and practiced reading from the children's books that Marcus kept behind the counter. Margaret had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and had saved enough to buy a small house 2 blocks away. Sarah had graduated nursing school with honors and now worked at the local hospital, but she still managed the diner's night shift 3 evenings a week. Under her leadership, the staff had created a pay-it-forward program where customers could buy meals for those who couldn't afford them. A simple board by the register showed dozens of prepaid meals waiting for anyone who needed them. The diner had become a training ground for young people entering the workforce, with Marcus personally mentoring each new employee about customer service, dignity, and respect. 3 former employees had used their experience and Marcus's recommendations to open their own successful businesses elsewhere in the city. Marcus had also established the Miller's Community Fund, which provided emergency assistance for rent, utilities, and groceries to local families in crisis. The fund grew from donations collected in a simple jar on the counter, but it had already helped over 100 families avoid eviction or hunger. Jerry Stevens had found his own path to redemption. After a year of reflection and some difficult conversations with his ex-wife, he had enrolled in community college and was studying social work. He'd even stopped by the diner once to apologize directly to Marcus. They weren't friends, but Jerry had learned something valuable about the man he wanted to be versus the man he'd been. The real magic of Miller's Diner wasn't in the food or even in Marcus's ownership. It was in the simple recognition that everyone who walked through that door was somebody's grandmother, somebody's child, somebody's hope for a better tomorrow. Marcus often thought about Patrick from Murphy's Corner Cafe, the man who taught him that kindness was a choice, not a luxury. Patrick had passed away the year before, but his lesson lived on every time Marcus looked across his diner and saw families sharing meals, teenagers doing homework, elderly customers enjoying conversation. And yes, sometimes people who just needed a warm place to wait out the storm. If this story inspired you to look at the people around you a little differently, to speak up when you see injustice, or to use whatever power you have to help instead of harm, then share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the world changes one act of courage at a time, and your moment to make a difference might be closer than you think.